We have a story for you, and this story is called Katie's Escape. And I hope you'll find the story interesting because it connects with our church story as well. In fact, it's kind of an introduction, so I hope you don't mind. And this is where the story took place. It took place in a town called Torgau, and would you believe it is 1 year short of 500 years ago that this story took place. So that's how long ago it took place. And a lot of things have not changed. For example, the castle that you see has been restored and repainted, etc. But it was there in Katie's time, 500 years ago. And there was a man who lived in the castle, as well as the bears, by your way. You saw the bear pit as in that first photograph, and we'll come back to that at the end of the story. But there was a man who lived in Torgau, and his job was like a lot of people have as their jobs at this time. They'd have a horse and cart, and they would deliver things all around the town. Sometimes they'd go to neighbouring towns. Sometimes they'd go a long way away. And you can see some old carts here. I don't know exactly what this man's cart looked like. I've suggested it looked like this one. You like that one? A couple of nice white horses and a good solid cart behind. And by the way, one of the things that's interesting about all these carts, I want you to notice, I've just gone back a minute, notice all their wheels. Is there any rubber on the wheels? Oh no, they've got a steel band around them that holds them together and hits the road, and then they would have wooden strap underneath that and spokes as well. Pretty rough riding in an old cart back in those days. Not much suspension either. Okay, so the man I'm talking about, his name was Leonard Koppel. And Leonard was a little bit more than a deliverer. He was a merchant because he used to go long distances and get a big cart of something and come back and sell it to people. And so he was buying and selling, not just delivering. And so Leonard is the kind of the hero of our story because he's going to do a good delivery. And this is what normally he was delivering things in, as you saw, barrels on some of those wagons and on his wagon as well. What do you think he might have been carting often in the barrels?
Fish or wine.
Fish or wine. Okay, now maybe because I'm beside the sea here, even though it's in Asia, and our story is actually in Germany, I should have told you that. Torgau was in Germany. But this is on the harbour side in Asia, and those barrels are filled with, you've got it right, they're filled with fish, all right? And probably these barrels, particularly the one that's on your left, is the one that was more like the barrels that he had. And you can see the one on the right the lid is taken off, and there you can see the fish inside. So he's delivering fish, and he did a lot of that. And with that in mind, we're going to now find that he takes his horse on a project that he was asked to do. He had to go down to a town that was about a day's drive away. Okay, now if you go there today, yeah, that's better. In fact, if it was a day's drive away, that'd be an hour away, wouldn't it? In fact, it's about as far as from here to Sydney. That's about how far away it was. And but normally on a horse and buggy, particularly loaded down, it would be a good day's horse, and wagon journey and so on. If you go to the place where he went to, and it was called Nimsham. At Nimsham, there was an old monastery there. Now today the monastery, and you can see it in the top part of the picture, it's been restored and new buildings have been built, and it's actually a hotel on the side of the road. But it used to be a monastery. Who's going to tell us what a monastery is?
It's a place where monks go to.
Okay, a place where monks go, and if it's...
Bible.
Okay, yes. And another name is sometimes used also, a convent, and that's often where the women will go, although sometimes the name monastery was used for ladies or men who would go to this very special place. And so here, and you can see, by the way, in the bottom picture, the dining room, a long dining room for functions, in the old castle has been restored and is used today as a part of the hotel. But if you get out into the back of the property, you can find that there are the ruins of old buildings that belonged to what was known as the Convent of Nimsham. And these are some of the ruins. And so this is where Leonard was sent to. He was sent to the convent. Now, what do you think he's going to deliver to the convent? Fish? You're right. And the person who sent him there knew that he made regular visits to the convent. But this time he has a very special task, because he's not just delivering, he's also doing a pickup. What do you pick up at the convent? I guess. All right. Let's have a look at the story. Okay. In the convent, one of the ladies who was there was called Katie. Actually, that was the name that was given to her later. She was called Katerina in the convent at that stage. But when she got about the age of 21, amongst the nuns in the convent there where she was, they started to hear things that were not what they were being taught in the convent. They started to hear that there was a man called Martin Luther, and I'll show you his picture, or a sketch that somebody has made of him. And they started hearing that Martin Luther said that your authority for what you believe doesn't come from the church or the convent that was controlled by the church, but rather your authority came from the Bible. And then one of the major teachings of the Bible that this lady, Katie, began to hear about was that you are not saved by anything you can do or even going to the church to get your salvation, but you're saved by having faith in Jesus Christ, and he will give you salvation as a gift, a free gift. Well, at first, Katie was she'd heard stories about this Martin Luther guy and the trouble that he was getting into, and how that the priests were wanting to capture him and do all kinds of things, and he was going to trials, etc. And she'd heard all about this, and she said, no, I'm not going to have anything to do with it because he doesn't support the church. But some of the other nuns who had been receiving this information from an uncle said, I don't think so. I think Martin Luther's onto something. Would you mind coming to the room tonight? And so after the people who were looking after the convent, the abbotess, etc., after she had gone to bed and was probably sound asleep, several of the nuns started to meet in one room reading these pamphlets that they were getting that were coming in from Martin Luther through an uncle of one of the nuns. And then Katie decided that the next meeting she'd bring a Bible from the library, and there was a new Bible in the library, and it was a new translation. There was a lot of excitement about it, and she brought that in, and they started comparing to see if what was in these pamphlets was in the Bible, until eventually Katie and 11 other nuns made the decision that what Martin Luther was saying was right, and the church was wrong about how it was saying you get salvation. And look, to cut a long story short, eventually a letter was sent to Martin Luther. They wrote a letter and sent it out through the uncle, went to Martin Luther and said, there are 12 of us here, we want to escape. Now, back in those days, if you were in a nunnery and you escaped, guess what? You could even face life imprisonment. That's how serious it was. So these girls were taking a big risk. And Martin Luther received their letter, received their request, and he began to think, what are we going to do? How are we going to get them out? And he wanted to, but how could he do it? And so this is what he decided. He decided that his friend Leonard, who he knew, who came from Torgau, and Martin Luther often visited Torgau. And he decided that if he delivered fish in barrels to the convent, then maybe he could work it so that when he arrived, he only had the one barrel of fish that he was selling to the convent, and all the others would be empty. And of course, when he'd emptied out that one, that would make 12 empty barrels on the back of the wagon. Well, Leonard thought about this for a while. He realised that if he got caught, it might be him who was having life imprisonment. But eventually he decided he'd do it. And so he turned up late. The abbotess wasn't very happy about that, but he turned up late. It was dark. He emptied out his fish, and he pretended to say, look, before I go, I'll just have a little bit of a rest. And he put the empty barrel back on with the other ones. By the way, can you imagine what it smelled like in one of those barrels? if it's been carrying fish. Oh. And it could be for a long time, even though sometimes the fish they carried was salted fish. They had kind of been partly prepared to preserve for a long time, but boy, they'd still smell. Anyway, so here he's got 12 empty barrels, and the arrangement that Leonard had worked out with Martin Luther, and that the message went back to the girls in the convent, was at such and such a time, it was around midnight, on this particular night, if they came to this corner of the convent and asked the man with the horses, was he Leonard? Then if he was Leonard, he would tell them how they were going to escape. And they didn't know at this stage how they were going to escape. So they were excited, though, to think, wow, tonight we can escape the convent. And so the time came. And they waited till the abbotess had gone to sleep and to bed, and everything was quiet, and they snuck out of the dormitory, and they went across to the far corner of the property, and they waited there in the dark, in the shadows, until sure enough, along came a horse and cart with some barrels on the back of it. This is going to be interesting. And one of the girls went up to Leonard very quietly, said, "Are you Leonard?" "Yes, I am. How many of you are there?" 12 of us. "Okay, I have 12 barrels for you." Barrels? Barrels what? "They are empty fish barrels, and will fit one of you in each of them." Well, can you imagine these girls, nuns, climbing up onto the wagon and looking at, oh, there's a dead fish still in the bottom of that one. Oh, sloshy in that one. Can you imagine what was going on with them? And thinking, who's going to get... He says, "You've got to get into the barrel or we're not getting out of here." So one by one, they climbed up into a barrel and sort of picked their legs up and shrunk right down. They just kind of fitted there. And they thought, is he going to stick a lid over the top of us and seal us in? We'll run out of air. But he didn't. What he did, he had a big tarp. And he stretched the tarp out right across the top of the barrels and tied it down so that the tarp obviously would flap a bit as it was travelling along, and it would give them a little bit of fresh air. So they felt a little bit more comfortable about that. And then, of course, it's now Leonard's job. And he ordered them, "Please be quiet, do not stand up, and stay there." And so off we go. Well, hi, welcome. And so this is what happened. They came, first of all, to the gate of the convent. And they had to wake the security man up here. And he said, "Oh, look, Leonard, just leaving late tonight." And he knew him. He said, "Oh, yeah, of course, you deliver the fish, that's okay." And off he went. Now, it wasn't so easy when he got to the gate of the town, because now the security guards were always changing and they didn't always know him. And sure enough, there was a new security guard on and he didn't know Leonard. So he thought, how are we going to do this? So anyway, he turned up and the security guard says, "What's in the barrels?" And, "Oh, dead fish." "Okay, you can go." And he waved him on because of the smell of the dead fish. Whew, that was a lucky one, wasn't it? So out the gate they went and out to the road. But hey, do you know how far they had to went? I mentioned it before. It's about as far as from here to Sydney. No bitumen roads, no nice freeways, ruts and potholes and bumps on steel wheels with no suspension. Can you imagine the ride that Katie and the other nuns who were escaping the convent had all the way to Torgau? It was a bumpy, bumpy ride. Sorry? Four-wheel driving. That's a good comment. Yeah, it could have been a bit like four-wheel driving and with a 8-legged horsepower. How about that one? Yeah. All right. So off they go. Now, the bumps were just something that was just horrible. But the girls obeyed. They didn't poke their heads up or jump up and push up the tarp or anything like that. They stayed there and they put up with the bumps. They put up with the pain. They endured it until finally, about daybreak, they noticed that the horse and buggy was slowing down and stopping on the side of the road. At last we're here. And Leonard went to the back of the wagon and he untied the ropes and flicked the tarp right back over and says quietly, and the girls peeped out and looked, "We're not at Torgau, we're out in the bush." He said, "Last toilet stop before Torgau." The girls were relieved about that. And so they quickly went off and did what they had to do, came back hopped back in, covered up again, because they still weren't safe out on the road at this stage, because there still were people around who could have captured them and taken them back to the convent and the punishment that would follow. And it wasn't until they got to Torgau, about midday the next day, that they felt safe and free. Can you imagine Katie? Can you imagine her sort of there at Torgau thinking, I'm free? And by the way, it was the start of Easter. And the first thing the girls did after they got cleaned up was they went to church and enjoyed the Good Friday service at the church. But guess what? Their journey wasn't over. They had to get back on the wagon, and I don't know whether they still use the fish barrels for the second half of the journey, but they had to go on to another town, and I'm going to tell you about that in my sermon today. So you might want to keep listening. But do you know what? You want to go back, don't you, and then we finished. Just go back to Torgau for a minute. You can imagine the girls coming into this lovely city, this lovely little town, and I would imagine they'd heard about the bear pit at the castle here, because this bear pit is actually each side of an entrance bridge that goes from the road across the bear pit into the castle. And I can see Katie, when she gets there, to race around and to have a look in the bear pit, because it was very close to where she went to church. And I can also see her thinking, oh, that's kind of sad. Those bears are not free. But I'm free. I have escaped the convent, and I have accepted Jesus' gift of salvation. It's a free gift, and I'm now free, and I'm going on to meet Martin Luther. And that's where I'm going to leave my story. Okay, I hope you enjoyed the story, and there's a bit more to it, and I'll share that with you in the sermon a little bit later on. Thanks for coming down, and have a good Sabbath. Good.